The judge mocks young black man in court, then realizes he's a legal genius. The murmurs in the gallery simmered down as 19-year-old Marcus Hayes shuffled nervously into the Kingsford County Courthouse. His slight frame, clad in an oversized shirt and scuffed sneakers, stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of the polished wood-paneled walls. The courtroom, bathed in harsh fluorescent light, seemed to sharpen every judgmental glance thrown his way. Sitting at the defense table alone, he clutched a stack of rumpled papers, his knuckles white as though he could squeeze confidence out of the pages. At the bench, Judge Eleanor Gray, renowned for her icy demeanor and zero-tolerance approach, lowered her glasses and shot him a look that felt colder than the marble pillars surrounding them. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a smirk that rippled into chuckles from the gallery, "do you realize the seriousness of defending yourself in this court?" The question dripped with condescension, her tone leaving no doubt that she had already dismissed him as an amateur. Marcus's eyes flickered nervously before locking with the judge's. His voice trembled as he replied, "Yes, Your Honor. I do." What followed would leave the courtroom stunned and Judge Gray questioning everything she thought she knew about the young man standing before her. Marcus Hayes had always been an outlier, but not in the way people assumed when they first saw him. At just 19 years old, Marcus possessed a mind that outpaced even seasoned professionals in legal circles. What people saw, however, was a young black man from a modest background, whose appearance, baggy clothes, worn sneakers, and an air of nervous determination, led them to underestimate him almost instantly. Born and raised in the working-class neighborhood of East Kingsford, Marcus's world was one of unpolished grit. His single mother, Evelyn Hayes, had worked 2 jobs for as long as Marcus could remember, instilling in him a relentless work ethic and an unshakable sense of justice. From a young age, Marcus had displayed an uncanny ability to absorb and analyze information. By the time he was 13, he had developed a fascination with the law, spending hours in the local library devouring legal textbooks and watching courtroom trials online. While other kids played video games or hung out at the mall, Marcus pored over case law and legal precedents. His peers found him odd, his teachers found him brilliant, and his mother found him inspiring. But brilliance alone wasn't enough to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. Growing up in East Kingsford meant constant exposure to systemic inequities. He had seen friends unfairly targeted by law enforcement, neighbors lose their homes due to convoluted legal loopholes, and his mother struggle with wage disputes that seemed insurmountable. Each injustice lit a fire in Marcus, pushing him to understand the law not just as a set of rules but as a weapon he could wield to protect those who needed it most. His academic journey was unconventional. Marcus skipped grades, completed high school at 15, and passed the bar exam at 18. Yet despite his extraordinary accomplishments, he chose to stay rooted in his community rather than chase opportunities in corporate law. For Marcus, the law wasn't a career, it was a calling. He wanted to be a voice for the voiceless, a shield for the vulnerable, and, most importantly, a challenge to the assumptions that often overshadowed his potential. The courtroom that day was no exception. To the spectators, Marcus was just another overconfident teenager destined to be humiliated. Judge Eleanor Gray, known for her no-nonsense demeanor and intolerance for courtroom theatrics, saw him as an unwelcome interruption to her morning docket. And yet, beneath Marcus's nerves, there was a quiet confidence born of preparation, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of truth. Marcus's life had been a series of battles against expectations. That day in court would be no different, except this time, the stakes were higher, and the stage was set for him to prove not just his case, but his worth. The courtroom buzzed with barely restrained whispers as Marcus Hayes took his place at the defendant's table. His nervous energy was evident in the way he fidgeted with the edge of his papers, though his face remained composed. The stakes may have been high, but Marcus had prepared for this moment with the kind of meticulousness that only comes from a life spent fighting to prove oneself. Judge Eleanor Gray called the court to order, her gavel slicing through the murmurs. She fixed Marcus with a cold, calculating stare, one that conveyed a mixture of skepticism and impatience. To her, this case was just another nuisance in an already packed docket, a routine traffic dispute that had somehow spiraled into an absurd spectacle. A young man defending himself, unrepresented and unqualified, seemed to her like a recipe for disaster. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her tone clipped and authoritative. "Do you understand the seriousness of this proceeding? And are you certain you wish to represent yourself?" Marcus stood, his knees feeling like they might give out under the weight of the room's attention. His voice, though slightly shaky, carried a tone of quiet determination. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm prepared." The gallery erupted in muffled laughter, a ripple of derision that caused Marcus's cheeks to flush. He gripped the papers in his hands more tightly, using the pressure to steady himself. Judge Gray's expression barely softened as she motioned for him to proceed. "Very well," she said. "Let's see what you've got." The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Victor Drake, smirked as he rose from his chair. Dressed in a tailored suit that exuded confidence and authority, Drake towered over Marcus in every way that seemed to matter in the eyes of the courtroom. He leaned into his opening statement with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, laying out the case against Marcus with practiced precision. According to Drake, Marcus had been caught speeding in a residential zone, clocked at 15 miles over the limit by a radar gun. An open and shut case, he implied, with no room for ambiguity. When Drake finished, the judge turned her attention back to Marcus. "Your response, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her tone tinged with skepticism. Marcus stepped forward, the shuffle of his worn sneakers echoing in the suddenly silent room. He cleared his throat, his gaze darting briefly to the gallery, where some spectators leaned forward, curious despite themselves. "Your Honor," he began, his voice stronger now, "I would like to challenge the validity of the evidence presented against me." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom, silenced only by the sharp rap of Judge Gray's gavel. "Explain," she said, narrowing her eyes at Marcus. Marcus nodded, holding up a diagram he had sketched on a sheet of notebook paper. It was rudimentary but detailed, showing the layout of the street where he had been pulled over, the position of the officer's vehicle, and the estimated distance between the radar gun and his car. "According to Section 40802(b) of the California Vehicle Code," Marcus said, "the conditions under which a radar gun is used must adhere to specific standards. Based on the officer's position, as outlined here," he pointed to the diagram, "the angle of the radar would result in an inaccurate reading." Victor Drake's smirk faltered slightly. He stood abruptly, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The officer's report is clear, and radar guns are regularly maintained to ensure accuracy." Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to Drake, his tone respectful but firm. "With all due respect, Counselor, can you provide documentation proving that the radar gun used in my case was calibrated and maintained according to regulation?" Drake hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. "That documentation isn't immediately available," he admitted, his voice taut. "But it's standard procedure." "Standard procedure isn't proof," Marcus interjected, turning back to Judge Gray. "The law requires verification, not assumptions. Without proper calibration records, the radar reading cannot be considered reliable evidence." The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Even Judge Gray appeared momentarily taken aback, her pen poised midair as she regarded Marcus with a newfound curiosity. This wasn't the fumbling defense of a teenager in over his head. This was something else entirely. Drake attempted to regain control, launching into a rebuttal that painted Marcus's argument as a distraction from the facts. But Marcus was prepared. With every point Drake raised, Marcus countered with precision, citing case law and legal precedent with a confidence that belied his age. He spoke not as a novice but as someone who had spent years mastering the intricacies of the legal system. Judge Gray leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze fixed on Marcus. "Mr. Hayes," she said, interrupting the back and forth, "where did you learn all of this?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before replying. "I've been studying law since I was 13, Your Honor. I passed the bar last year." Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by a wave of murmurs that grew louder despite the judge's gavel. Even Drake's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "You're a licensed attorney?" Judge Gray asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. But I've also spent my life being underestimated. People assume I don't belong in rooms like this. I've learned to let my work speak for itself." Judge Gray studied him for a long moment, her stern expression softening just slightly. "Very well," she said, her tone less harsh than before. "Continue." As Marcus resumed his argument, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a routine case now felt like something far more significant. The gallery, once filled with skeptics and scoffers, leaned in closer, hanging on to Marcus's every word. Even Judge Gray, known for her unflinching demeanor, seemed genuinely engaged. For Marcus, this wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about proving himself in a world that had already decided who he was and what he could achieve. As the initial conflict unfolded, it became clear that this young man was far more formidable than anyone had anticipated. The courtroom was no longer just a space for routine legal proceedings. With each passing moment, it transformed into an arena. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and Marcus Hayes stood at the center of it all, his unassuming demeanor masking the fiery determination within him. What had started as a seemingly straightforward traffic case was quickly becoming a battle of intellect, resilience, and perception, a battle Marcus was determined to win. Victor Drake, the seasoned prosecutor, felt the shift in the room as clearly as everyone else. His confidence had been unshakable at first, bolstered by years of courtroom victories. But Marcus's performance was unlike anything he'd encountered from an opposing attorney, let alone a 19-year-old representing himself. The murmurs in the gallery and even the subtle nods of approval from Judge Eleanor Gray hinted at something Drake wasn't used to, the possibility of losing. "Your Honor," Drake said, rising from his seat, his voice measured but carrying an edge of frustration. "The defense's argument, while detailed, hinges on technicalities. The fact remains, the defendant was clocked exceeding the speed limit in a residential zone. This is a clear violation of the law." Marcus stood as Drake finished, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He knew this was a pivotal moment. He had to not only counter Drake's points but also dismantle the perception that he was relying on obscure loopholes. "Your Honor," Marcus began, addressing Judge Gray directly, "the prosecution's assertion that my defense is based on technicalities is misleading. The law is built on technicalities, rules and procedures designed to ensure fairness and accuracy. If those rules are not followed, how can we trust the validity of the evidence presented?" Judge Gray tilted her head slightly, her pen tapping rhythmically against her notepad. She didn't interrupt, allowing Marcus to continue. "The radar gun used to measure my speed," Marcus said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "has no documented proof of calibration. Without that, there is no guarantee the reading was accurate. Furthermore, the officer's position and angle when the reading was taken are critical factors that have not been addressed." He gestured to his diagram, still displayed on the evidence table. "This diagram outlines the spatial limitations that would make an accurate reading impossible from the officer's location. These are not minor details. They are fundamental to ensuring that justice is served fairly." Drake's jaw tightened. He could feel the gallery's attention shifting further toward Marcus. But he wasn't ready to concede. Rising from his chair, he addressed Judge Gray with a tone that bordered on exasperation. "Your Honor, the defense is asking this court to dismiss evidence based on conjecture. Radar guns are routinely used across the country and are trusted instruments of law enforcement. To suggest that every case relying on radar evidence is flawed would be absurd." Marcus's lips twitched into a slight smile, not one of arrogance, but of readiness. He'd anticipated this argument. "Your Honor," Marcus countered, "I am not suggesting that radar guns are inherently flawed. I am arguing that in this specific case, the evidence presented fails to meet the required standard of reliability. The prosecution's inability to provide calibration records or address the positional inaccuracies I've outlined calls the entire case into question." Judge Gray raised her hand, silencing the rising murmurs in the gallery. Her sharp eyes darted between Drake and Marcus before settling on the young defendant. Mr. Hayes, your arguments are compelling, but I need more than theories and diagrams. Do you have any precedent to support your claims? Marcus nodded, stepping forward with a confidence that seemed to grow with every word. Yes, Your Honor. In People v. Knight, the court ruled that evidence obtained through improperly calibrated radar equipment was inadmissible. The ruling emphasized the importance of documentation to verify the accuracy of such equipment. Additionally, in State v. Williams, the court found that the positioning of the radar device played a critical role in determining its reliability. He paused, letting his words settle over the room. These cases highlight that the integrity of evidence is paramount. Without proper verification, we risk convicting individuals based on flawed or incomplete information. The gallery was silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Even Judge Gray appeared to be considering his points carefully. She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Counselor Drake, she said after a moment, do you have a rebuttal? Drake's frustration was evident as he stood once more. Your Honor, while I acknowledge the defense's references to case law, I maintain that this is a simple matter of enforcement. The officer's testimony and the radar reading should be sufficient to uphold the charge. Marcus interjected, his tone respectful but firm. With all due respect, Your Honor, the prosecution's reliance on the officer's testimony without corroborating evidence undermines the principles of due process. If the roles were reversed, and I was the one presenting unsupported claims, they would be dismissed without hesitation. Judge Gray's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze fixed on Drake. The room seemed to hold its breath as she considered Marcus's argument. Finally, she nodded. I'll allow this line of questioning to continue. Mr. Hayes, proceed. Marcus's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was his chance to drive his point home. He turned to the officer who had issued the ticket, now seated at the witness stand. Officer Carter, Marcus began. Can you confirm the exact calibration date of the radar gun used during my stop? The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Drake. I don't have that information with me, he admitted. And can you confirm your exact position relative to my vehicle when you recorded the radar reading? Marcus pressed. Carter shifted uncomfortably. I was parked at the corner of Elm and Pine, he said. Marcus nodded, gesturing to his diagram. According to my measurements, your position at the corner would have required the radar signal to pass through multiple obstructions, including parked vehicles and a slight incline in the road. How do you account for these factors in your reading? Carter opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Gray leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Officer, can you provide a clear answer? Carter's shoulders sagged slightly. No, Your Honor. The gallery erupted in murmurs once again, and Judge Gray's gavel came down sharply. Order! She barked, her voice cutting through the noise. She turned to Marcus, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hayes, she said, I'll admit your defense has given this court much to consider. However, we are not yet finished. I'd like both parties to present closing arguments tomorrow morning. Marcus nodded, his nerves and exhaustion battling his sense of accomplishment. He had managed to shift the momentum in his favor, but he knew the battle wasn't over. As he gathered his papers, the eyes of the gallery followed him, their expressions a mixture of respect and curiosity. For Marcus, the escalation of the conflict was both a challenge and an opportunity. He had not only held his ground against a seasoned prosecutor but had begun to dismantle the very assumptions that had defined his life. Tomorrow would be the true test, and he was ready to face it head-on. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Marcus Hayes arrived at the courthouse, his bag slung over his shoulder and his papers neatly stacked. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. He'd succeeded in planting doubt in the judge's mind, but he knew today would be even more grueling. Victor Drake wasn't the type to accept defeat without a fight, and Marcus's arguments would face their fiercest test yet. As the gallery filled, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Reporters who had caught wind of the previous day's drama filed into the courtroom, their notepads ready. Marcus felt the weight of their eyes, their cameras, and their expectations. But he forced himself to focus. This wasn't about public opinion, it was about justice. Judge Eleanor Gray entered, her gavel striking the bench. "Court is now in session," she announced, her tone measured but slightly less cold than the day before. "We'll hear closing arguments from both sides. Counselor Drake, you may proceed." Drake rose with a practiced air of authority. His sharp suit and deliberate pace were calculated to exude control. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and commanding, "this case, at its core, is a straightforward matter. The defendant was caught speeding in a residential zone, as confirmed by the radar reading and the officer's testimony. While Mr. Hayes has raised questions about procedural details, none of his arguments negate the fact that he violated the law." He turned to the gallery, addressing the audience as much as the judge. "We cannot allow the defendant to obscure the truth with technicalities. The safety of our streets depends on upholding the integrity of law enforcement tools like radar guns. To dismiss this case would set a dangerous precedent." Drake's words hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed as though the courtroom leaned in his favor. Marcus could feel the shift, but he refused to let it shake him. As Drake took his seat, Judge Gray turned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone neutral but expectant. "Your closing argument." Marcus stood, taking a deep breath as he approached the bench. His palms were damp, but his voice remained steady. "Your Honor, distinguished members of the court," he began, "this case is not just about a speeding ticket. It's about the principles that underpin our legal system: fairness, accuracy, and the burden of proof." He walked to the evidence table, holding up his diagram once more. "The prosecution has failed to provide the necessary documentation to verify the radar gun's accuracy. Without calibration records, we cannot be certain that the speed reading was reliable. Furthermore, the officer's position and the obstructions I've outlined call the validity of the reading into serious question." Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Your Honor, this isn't about finding loopholes or avoiding accountability. It's about ensuring that the evidence used to convict someone is beyond reproach. If we allow unreliable evidence to stand, we undermine the very foundation of justice." Judge Gray watched him intently, her pen still in her hand but unmoving. Marcus knew she was listening, but he also knew she was weighing every word carefully. As he returned to his seat, the courtroom remained silent, the tension so thick it felt almost tangible. Judge Gray took a moment before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "I will take these arguments under advisement and deliver my ruling after a brief recess." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Marcus exhaled, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his papers. He'd done everything he could, but the outcome was now out of his hands. The minutes dragged on as Marcus sat in the hallway outside the courtroom. The weight of the morning's arguments pressed down on him, each second stretching endlessly. His mother, Evelyn, appeared by his side, her presence a source of quiet comfort. "You were amazing in there," she said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder. Marcus managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom. I just hope it was enough." Before Evelyn could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and a clerk stepped out. "Court is back in session," she announced. Marcus's stomach tightened, but he rose to his feet, his mother's reassuring squeeze on his arm grounding him. As he re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere felt heavier than before. Judge Gray's expression was as inscrutable as ever as she took her seat. The gallery sat in hushed anticipation, every eye on the judge. After reviewing the arguments presented by both sides, Judge Gray began, her voice even. "I find this case to be more complex than it initially appeared. Mr. Hayes has raised valid concerns regarding the reliability of the evidence presented against him. However," Marcus's heart sank at the pause, his mind racing to brace for the worst. "The absence of calibration records and the unresolved questions about the officer's position create enough doubt that I cannot, in good conscience, uphold the charge. The motion to dismiss is granted." The gavel struck, and for a moment, Marcus couldn't process the words. Then, Like a dam breaking, relief and disbelief flooded through him. The gallery erupted in murmurs and scattered applause, silenced only by Judge Gray's sharp rap of the gavel. "Order!" she commanded, her gaze sweeping the room before returning to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, you have demonstrated a remarkable understanding of the law. I misjudged you when you first walked into this courtroom. That was my mistake, and I commend you for proving me wrong." Marcus rose, his legs unsteady but his voice clear. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he gathered his belongings, the weight of the past few days began to lift. But he knew this was just the beginning. The courtroom doors opened to a swarm of reporters, their cameras and questions aimed directly at him. Marcus hesitated, the flash of lights momentarily blinding him. "Marcus! Marcus Hayes! How does it feel to win?" one reporter called out. He raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I'm just glad the truth came out," he said simply. "This wasn't about winning. It was about fairness." The reporters clamored for more, but Marcus pushed through the crowd, his mother at his side. Outside, the crisp air filled his lungs, a welcome contrast to the stifling tension of the courtroom. "You did it," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. Marcus nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah," he said softly. "But there's so much more to do." For Marcus, the dismissal of his case wasn't just a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of preparation, perseverance, and the unwavering belief in the principles of justice. As he walked away from the courthouse, he knew that this was only the first step in a journey that would test him in ways he had yet to imagine. Marcus sat in the courthouse conference room, poring over his notes one last time before the final session. The legal jargon, the citations, the diagrams, it all felt like a blur after the long and sleepless nights he had spent preparing. Today would be his last chance to sway the court, and though his arguments had been compelling so far, he knew this was the moment that would define the outcome. The door creaked open, and Evelyn peeked her head in. "They're ready for you," she said softly. Marcus looked up, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the tension building inside him. He nodded, rising slowly. "I'm ready," he replied, though the weight in his chest suggested otherwise. As he entered the courtroom, the hum of murmurs from the gallery buzzed in his ears. Word had spread about the young man's self-representation and his ability to hold his own against a seasoned prosecutor. The gallery was now packed, not just with locals but with journalists, legal enthusiasts, and even a few law students eager to witness the culmination of this improbable case. Victor Drake, ever composed, was already seated at the prosecution's table, shuffling his neatly prepared documents. He glanced up at Marcus, offering a faint smirk that seemed to say, "Good luck keeping up." But Marcus had no time for intimidation. His focus was on the bench, where Judge Eleanor Gray sat, her expression as unreadable as ever. Her steely gaze swept across the room before landing on him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice sharp and measured. "Are you prepared to proceed?" Marcus stood, smoothing the front of his shirt. "Yes, Your Honor." "I am." "Good," she said. "Because this court expects nothing less than your very best." The judge's words were not a compliment but a challenge, and Marcus understood that he was still on trial in more ways than one. As he sat down, the clerk called the session to order, and the final arguments began. Drake was the first to speak. He rose with the confident posture of a man who had weathered countless legal storms. His voice, steady and deliberate, filled the room as he laid out the prosecution's final case. "Your Honor, members of the court," Drake began, "we've heard many arguments from the defense, and while I respect Mr. Hayes's initiative, we must not lose sight of the facts. The radar reading, confirmed by Officer Carter, places the defendant in violation of the speed limit. The integrity of our legal system relies on the trustworthiness of law enforcement and the tools they use. To dismiss this case would undermine the very foundation of public safety." Drake gestured toward Marcus as he continued. "The defense's argument hinges on sowing doubt, on technicalities that obscure the simple truth. This case is not about procedural perfection, it's about accountability. The evidence may not be flawless, but it is sufficient." He concluded his statement with a sharp glance at the judge. For these reasons, Your Honor, I urge the court to uphold the citation and ensure that justice is served. Drake's words lingered in the air, and Marcus felt their weight pressing down on him. The prosecutor had painted him as a troublemaker, a distraction, someone who was exploiting the system. It was up to Marcus now to show the court that this wasn't just about him. It was about the principles of justice themselves. Judge Gray turned to Marcus. Mr. Hayes, your rebuttal? Marcus stood, his nerves momentarily tightening his throat. He swallowed hard and stepped forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium as he began. Your Honor, members of the court. He started, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. This case is not about undermining law enforcement or dismissing the importance of public safety. It is about ensuring that the methods used to enforce the law are fair, accurate, and beyond reproach. He walked to the evidence table, picking up the diagram he had prepared. Holding it up for the court to see, he continued. The prosecution has argued that this is a simple case. But simplicity does not absolve us of the responsibility to question the validity of the evidence presented. Without calibration records, without proper documentation, and with the questions surrounding the officer's position, we cannot say with certainty that the radar reading was accurate. Marcus turned to face the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the faces watching him. This is not a technicality. This is a corner gray of justice. If we accept flawed evidence in this case, what's to stop it from happening in others? How many innocent people could be penalized because we didn't demand better standards? Judge Gray's pen was still, her eyes locked on Marcus as he spoke. The gallery, too, seemed to hold its breath, hanging on to his every word. Marcus's voice grew stronger, his confidence building. Your Honor, the law is not just a set of rules. It's a promise that everyone, regardless of their age, appearance, or circumstances, will be treated fairly. That promise is only as strong as the evidence we allow to uphold it. In this case, the evidence is simply not strong enough. He took a step back, his hands trembling slightly as he set the diagram down. For these reasons, Your Honor, I respectfully ask this court to dismiss the charge against me. Not because I want to avoid accountability, but because the evidence does not meet the burden of proof required by law. Marcus returned to his seat, the tension in the room so thick it was almost suffocating. Judge Gray remained silent for a moment, her expression unreadable as she processed the arguments. Finally, she spoke. This court will recess briefly before delivering its verdict, she announced, striking her gavel. We will reconvene in 30 minutes. As Marcus stepped outside the courtroom, the cool air hit him like a wave, offering a brief reprieve from the pressure inside. Evelyn joined him, her hand on his shoulder. You did everything you could, she said, her voice filled with pride. Now it's up to the judge. Marcus nodded, though the weight of the moment made it hard to feel relief. He had poured everything he had into this case, and now all he could do was wait. As he glanced back at the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just his speeding ticket. This was a fight for fairness, respect, and the chance to prove that even the most underestimated voices could make a difference. With 30 minutes until the court's decision, Marcus knew the next steps would determine not only the outcome of his case but also the way the world would see him moving forward. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Eleanor Gray returned to the bench, her expression as inscrutable as ever. Marcus Hayes stood by the defense table, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He clutched his notes, though he doubted he'd need them now. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the moment his arguments would either be validated or dismissed entirely. Judge Gray adjusted her glasses, her sharp gaze sweeping across the courtroom before landing on Marcus. Before I deliver my verdict, she began, her tone measured and deliberate, I want to acknowledge the efforts of both parties in presenting their cases. This has been an unusual proceeding, but one that highlights the complexities of our legal system. The gallery held its collective breath, the tension in the room so thick it felt like a tangible force pressing down on everyone. Even Victor Drake, the seasoned prosecutor who had exuded confidence throughout the trial, sat with his hands clasped tightly, his jaw set in a rigid line. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Gray continued, turning her full attention to Marcus, "you have argued this case with a level of preparation and insight that is remarkable for someone of your age and experience. However, legal arguments alone are not enough. The court's decision must be based on the evidence presented." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced through every word he'd spoken, every point he'd made, every piece of evidence he'd highlighted. Had it been enough? Judge Gray's expression softened slightly, a hint of something almost resembling respect flickering in her eyes. "After careful consideration of the arguments and evidence," she said, "I find that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof required to uphold the charge against Mr. Hayes." The words hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the gallery, quickly escalating into scattered applause. Marcus stood frozen, the judge's ruling echoing in his ears. The charge had been dismissed. Judge Gray banged her gavel sharply, restoring order. "I remind the court that this is not a spectacle," she said sternly, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Hayes, while I may have initially underestimated you, your performance in this courtroom has been exemplary. You've demonstrated not only a deep understanding of the law but also a commitment to its principles. I encourage you to pursue this path further." Marcus nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor." With a final strike of the gavel, the session was adjourned. The courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity as reporters, spectators, and legal professionals rushed to process what had just occurred. Marcus gathered his belongings, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the moment began to sink in. Before he could leave the courtroom, Victor Drake approached him, his demeanor surprisingly cordial. "Mr. Hayes," he said, extending a hand, "you gave me quite the challenge in there. Well done." Marcus shook his hand, his grip firm despite his nerves. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that." As Marcus stepped out into the courthouse hallway, a wave of reporters descended upon him, microphones and cameras thrust in his direction. Questions came at him from every angle. "Marcus, how does it feel to win? What inspired you to take on this case by yourself? What's next for you?" Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "I'm just glad the truth came out," he said simply. "This case wasn't about winning or losing. It was about fairness. That's what matters most." The crowd's questions continued, but Marcus managed to break free, retreating to the safety of a quiet corridor where his mother, Evelyn, was waiting for him. She pulled him into a tight embrace, tears shining in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with pride. "You did it." Marcus smiled, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. "We did it, Mom. I couldn't have done this without you." As they left the courthouse together, the weight of the case finally lifting, Marcus couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice wasn't over, not for him, not for his community, and not for the countless others whose voices deserved to be heard. But for now, he'd savor this victory, knowing it was a step towards something greater. The courthouse steps were alive with chatter and camera flashes as Marcus Hayes and his mother emerged into the crisp afternoon air. The reporters swarmed closer, their voices overlapping in an eager attempt to capture the young man's thoughts. Marcus held his head high, though the weight of the day, and the weeks leading up to it, was evident in his eyes. Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, her silent support grounding him as he faced the growing crowd. "Mr. Hayes, do you believe this case will inspire others?" one reporter called out. Marcus paused, the question striking a chord. "I hope so," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind around him. "This case wasn't just about me. It was about proving that fairness and justice should never be compromised, no matter who you are or where you come from." The reporters pressed on with more questions, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling he'd said all he needed to. Together, he and Evelyn made their way down the steps and into the bustling streets of Kingsford. The weight of the moment lingered, but so did the sense of triumph. Marcus had faced incredible odds and emerged victorious, not just for himself but for a principle that transcended the confines of the courtroom. That evening, as they sat at their small kitchen table, Evelyn couldn't stop smiling. "I always knew you'd do something extraordinary," she said, her voice full of pride. "But this is just the beginning, Marcus." Marcus nodded, a quiet determination flickering in his eyes. "It is, Mom. There's so much more I want to do. So many people out there who don't get a fair shot. If I can use what I've learned to help them, then that's what I'll do." The day's events began to ripple outward almost immediately. Clips of Marcus's arguments and Judge Gray's ruling went viral, sparking debates online about systemic biases and the importance of holding legal processes to the highest standards. Messages flooded in from strangers offering congratulations, support, and even job offers. Law firms reached out, impressed by his poise and brilliance, though Marcus remained cautious about the path he wanted to take. Judge Gray, in a rare interview, admitted that the case had reminded her of the importance of humility in her position. "Marcus Hayes challenged me to reconsider my assumptions," she said. "And for that I'm grateful. He reminded me that the law is only as strong as the fairness with which it is applied." As the weeks passed, Marcus returned to his books, determined to deepen his knowledge and refine his skills. The court victory was a mileage, but not a conclusion. It was a call to action, a reminder that one voice, when armed with truth and perseverance, could spark change. For Marcus, the journey was just beginning. And as he walked into the future, he carried with him the lessons of the courtroom, the pride of his mother, and the hope that his story might inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand justice, no matter the odds. If Marcus's journey to justice inspired you, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that challenge assumptions and highlight the power of perseverance. Don't miss our next tale of courage and truth in the face of adversity. What did you think of Marcus's story? Would you have had the courage to stand up for yourself in court? Share your thoughts in the comments and join the conversation. Your perspective matters. Did you catch the key moment that turned the tide in Marcus's favor? Let us know your favorite part in the comments. And don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs a little inspiration today.